I'm back. It's me with another new angle. Guess who's back in the house? It's me, because it's my house. Hello, and welcome to The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library card, darling. I clearly keep mine in my bra. That's what that was, little mime. Welcome back to another fabulous episode. You may have noticed these have been coming out more regularly of late, given the pandemic that we're currently undergoing. It's quite weird though if someone watched this back in like 10 years. Not that I've got that kind of longevity, but if I did, they'd be like, what pandemic? You know, I was talking to someone the other day and they were like, this year is the year that we're all going to be invited into primary schools to talk about in history class. You know, like the war and things like that. You know, they get people, don't they, that lived through it to come back. Got me a big cup of tea. It's clearly not my mug. You ever seen someone who looks more like an 18-year-old ready to party? But yeah. This is actually quite nice because it's keeping me constant because I'm working from home, so I'm just sort of filming these as and when I finish books rather than waiting for like a weekly video session, which is probably a good thing because there's more immediacy to it in terms of having the plot fresh in my mind and stuff. And by God, I needed it with this one. That's not a bad, by the way, it's a very good. This time I wanted to talk about this rather marvellous novel, which is called Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. Smell check? Yeah, it's good. It's not spell check, it's smell check on this channel. And I bought this because I read the back and I like the cover. No, that's not true. I knew it was set in a performing arts school, which obviously I went to one as well, so I'm sort of naturally geared towards stuff that takes place in environments that I recognise. I find that really interesting. There's quite a few books about that I've bought that are set in like the theatre industry or, you know, the theatre education industry that I just find really interesting because it's interesting as well to see what the difference is between people who've been in that world and how they describe it, and then people who haven't and what they think it is. That's always really interesting difference, because my experience in theatre school was in some ways very much like the cliche, but in many ways also very not. So there's an interesting disparity there that I find quite fascinating. Just shout out before we carry on, my Breakfast Club jumper. Been told I've got to start showing my clothes on here, which is fine when it's something I actually like. It's when it's my scrags, it's a bit more. But scrags is the word for things you wear around the house, by the way, if you wondered. I'm also wearing these, again, little yoga pants, harems, donated by my fabulous mother Gemini Androgyne of those vegan guys. Well, she's not a vegan guy, but she knows them quite well. So yeah, Trust Exercise. It's set in a performing arts school. Well, okay. The Daily Telegraph, the Torygraph, called it a Russian doll of a novel, and it absolutely is that. Here's why. So the first part of this book is set in a performing arts school, and our sort of protagonist is a student called Sarah. And this is not like a degree level establishment. This is sort of like, the Fame School on TV and films Fame. So they'd have like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year of high school, but it's a performing arts specialist school. And Sarah gains admittance to the school, and she sort of falls in this weird obsessive love relationship with this other student called David. And they're under the guidance of this teacher called Mr. Kingsley, who is very much a theatre teacher of the old school, in the sense that, you know, we might conjecture that some of his methods are very old-fashioned in the sense that they're not necessarily either PC or health and safety aware. So he sort of pushes them emotionally a lot through a series of what he calls trust exercises, which I actually recognise because what they're doing in some of the trust exercises is a sort of bastardisation of the technique that I learned, which is rooted in Stanislavski's system of acting, but as filtered through Sanford Meisner, and one of his exercises, which is called the repetition exercise, which, if you don't know, is you sit facing another person and you repeat something you notice or something that arises in the moment until it changes. So, for instance, I might look you in the eye and say, "You have eyes." That's the cliche line to open with, "You have eyes." You would repeat, "I have eyes, you have eyes, I have eyes, you have eyes, I have eyes," and then you don't repeat indefinitely, but then you might say, "Oh, you blinked, I blinked, you blinked, I'm not blinking now, you're not blinking now," and you're supposed to respond in the moment but without thinking, so you're not allowed to use gaps, and the idea behind that is that it encourages spontaneity in your acting, so you're not reproducing sort of tired patterns of behaviour, keeping it fresh and spontaneous. That's a really massive overview, and I'm not a Meisner specialist. That's not what I teach. That's not my specialism. But just it's interesting because it's kind of similar. And Sarah has these sort of tumultuous emotional issues with David throughout their relationship, which becomes more outlandish as it goes along, including one quite memorable scene where they have sex in the middle of the music room, with the doors all open and everything like that, and I was like, "Oh, girl, okay," but you won't catch me doing it on tiled flooring, and I think not. Imagine the sweat marks, that'd be horrible. And then this Mr. Kingsley is sort of, she becomes his pet for a while because she's able to be emotionally open, and he's pushing her and forcing her and David to keep doing these trust exercises, and David's not doing very well with them, and they're sort of stuck in this weird cycle of not being able to relate to each other and then move on. In the interim, a sort of coachload of British theatre kids come over from Bournemouth to do their production of Candide, which ends up being a very risque and a bit sort of, I don't want to say inappropriate, but maybe not what was expected. But they sort of disrupt the class's lives as well. When one of them takes an interest in Sarah, and she and David have this weird sort of breakup, and then their teacher, Martin, is interested in one of the students, and there's something sort of eggy going on there, and so on and so forth. Now, this is about 131 pages or something like that, and then it flips. And then you start reading the next bit, because it's only divided into 3 sections, and it's not like, named after chapters or so on and so forth. It's just divided like this. So each section opens with trust exercise. And then it flips. So the first trust exercise section is, as I say, Sarah's narrative. The second is a character called Karen, who's sort of in the background of Sarah's narrative, where we discover that actually the first part is a fictionalized account by Sarah, the author, of her experiences of the performing arts school, and that most of it isn't actually true. So we open with Karen going to a book signing to sort of confront Sarah in a way, but quite softly, with the issues of the past and why she's misrepresented them to such a level. Like, for instance, there's things like characters didn't really exist, or she's attributed different behaviours to different people, or told about circumstances that didn't happen the way that she describes them as happening, and so on and so forth. So it was kind of on the back foot. Just making that really quick mental flip to go, oh, okay, so that was not real, but this is real. But by this point, our trust's undermined in the narrator, really cleverly. And we're like, well, how do I know this is real then? And yeah, so Karen tells her story, which is what she did 20 years later in confronting Sarah, and also the relationships that she's formed. The English school teacher comes back to produce one of his plays, and he's been now accused of inappropriate behaviour with one of his students back home, a couple of his students, and then there's the inference that he got Karen pregnant and that she had the baby adopted. And also she's now working with David, who's become a director, because apparently he was a terrible actor. That bit's quite funny. And he's now producing Martin's play, which Karen wangles her way into as the only female character, and then sort of, in a way, sort of manipulates Sarah into becoming her dresser, and things get quite explosive. Then by the third trust exercise, for goodness sake, so we've had Sarah's narrative, which we now know is fiction, or we think we know. We've had Karen's reflections on that, which is reality, or so we think. And then in the third one, we're introduced to a brand new character called Claire, who's in therapy. Turns out Claire was adopted and is looking for her birth mother. So she ends up going to a performing arts school and looking up the teacher who would have taught her mum. That's the only thing she knows about her from the birth records, the adoption papers, I should say. And he then won't say anything about it because of confidentiality or whatever, but lures her over to his flat where he assaults her sexually. And she's left with sort of no further information other than one of the school secretaries recognises her, or rather recognises her appearance, and we're left with this beautiful line, which is, are we still recognised if seen by the wrong eyes? So now, by the end of the book, I'm like, okay, so it would seem to make sense to me that Claire is Karen's daughter that was adopted, but does the English school teacher really exist? Or was that one of Karen's fictions commenting on Sarah's fiction? It's like Inception, isn't it? And if he didn't, is it in fact that the teacher at the school who sexually assaults Claire actually had the relationship with... This is what it made me think. There's no inference, I was just thinking. That he impregnated her, in which case was she sexually assaulted by her father? Like, what the hell's going on? And just as you're about to go, oh, I want some clarity, it finishes, which is his genius, because actually, in many ways, the plot's kind of secondary, although it is very intriguing. I wrote down some notes, actually, because normally I just speak off the top of my head, but I want to get some clarity. You can't see that, but yeah. Pencil's my Where's Wally pencil. I think I nicked that from work. Sorry. And I wrote down what's really interesting about this is, whose story is this, really? What's the truth? And does it matter? Because I sort of keep being drawn to these books about... I don't know if it's me being drawn to them, or if in fact I'm just seeing these issues in everything, or if it's just a popular topic, but I suppose I'm sort of wondering, I keep coming upon these books that are about memory and, you know, remembrance of things past. Little literary joke there, because that's the title of the book. And I suppose how we remember. So I'm looking at doing, at some stage, I say, clearly not right now, I'm looking at doing a PhD at some point, and I'm really interested in the art of storytelling, and more specifically, I suppose, the ethics of storytelling in terms of who do stories belong to, and who gets to claim ownership for what story, because as a theatre maker, I make a lot of I make a lot of autobiographical work, which is fine because it's my story, but is it? Because the things I describe happen to other people as well, so who has the greater claim on the story? And that made me think a lot about this, because I think that while facts and truth are important, debatably in certain circumstances, I think how we remember and how we memorialize is as interesting as what the truth is. And maybe there are multiple truths, because if you perceive something and you remember it with that perception, but somebody else perceives it in another way, who's to say that one of you is correct and one of you isn't? Maybe both are true, just they affected your brain in a different way, so you memorize them differently. Does that make sense? Because I think that even in its fiction itself is a kind of truth, a subjective truth, but a truth nonetheless. And I think, is there really objective truth? So for instance, I suppose I could say the sky is blue, which appears to be an objective truth. However, how do I know that the blue I see when I look at the sky and think that's blue is the same blue that anybody else sees? Therefore, I can't objectively say that the sky is blue, because I don't know what blue looks like to anybody else or everybody else. Maybe I'm the only person in the world who sees that colour when I look at the sky as it is right now. You know? So I suppose that's quite a facetious diatribe, but I just find that really fascinating. It's a film, I can't remember, it's a Japanese film. Gosh, I wish I could remember what it was called. And it's the same event that takes place, but from 4 different perspectives, so every story is completely different. And that's kind of what's going on here, isn't it? You're just sort of unpacking, which sort of makes sense of the Russian doll comment. You're like, that's the story. Oh, wait. That's the story. Oh, wait. That's the story. And what's really great about Susan Choi's writing is she keeps you guessing up to the next minute, because once she's undermined you, well, once any author has done that, the unreliable narrator, then you start going, well, how do I trust anybody? You can't, and does that matter? Maybe not. So basically, the title makes a lot of sense in that respect as well, because isn't the entire novel, or any novel for that matter, an example of the trust exercise in action? You have to a greater or lesser extent, put your trust somewhere, even if it's only for a very short space of time, in order to get through something and believe it with any veracity, or believe it in any capacity. It's a little poem there. With any veracity in any capacity. Yeah, I'll start writing songs soon. Or I won't. So yeah, I really love this. There's not an awful lot of lines I can pick out, because it's not, for my mind, that kind of book. It's more the book where you just have to experience the whole thing and then go, as opposed to, do you know, like, you get some books that you have to sort of pause and sit with some of the prose for a while, because it's been really beautifully done. And then some you're just like, you have to go to the next plot point, and then you appreciate the infrastructure. Neither is better than the other. It's just a comment. This is one of those. And it's just really nice to have that little performing arts connection thrown in as well. The School of Performing Arts that's mentioned, and this is kind of horrific in many ways, but as I said before, I do recognise aspects of my professional training in it. However, mine was much more pleasant. Fewer Russian dolls as well, but lots of Chekhov. No, fewer Russian dolls, but lots of Chekhov. That should be my byline, shouldn't it? So yeah, I do completely recommend this, if only for a mental exercise, I suppose. But that makes it sound like it's hard work, and it's not. I read it in like a day. It smells so good. can't claim that your copy will smell as good as well. It depends where you get it from. Just a disclaimer. But I absolutely have no hesitation in recommending this. Just give your mind a workout, in a very different way than giving your mind a workout with like a classical text, which is more, obviously more of an exertion in terms of deciphering the text and so on and so forth. This is more of a sort of a salt course of the brain, if you will, and that's great. It forces you to meditate on your own memories and how subjective they are, and how we talk about, as I have on this channel a lot, how we talk about nostalgia and the falsehood of it, and how memory and nostalgia often exist to satisfy themselves, as opposed to being any kind of objective truth about either life or our own experience. So I think that's interesting. So trust exercise, Susan Choi. She should be paying me for this advertising. I've shown you 3 times now. Well, thank you for joining me once again, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really hope you're all taking care of yourselves and staying safe out there. It's a bit of a rough time world-wise, I know that. And, any little bit of unity and togetherness we can spread, however that is, spread, that's a poor choice of words, online, is nothing but a plus, in my opinion. So do sound off in the comments below. I always love to hear from you, be that sharing a recommendation, sharing your stories, responses, or just saying howdy. I love that. Oh, and put your library cards away. Mine's going back in my bra. It's not a real library card. And I will see you on the next episode. Much love. Mwah. Whew.